Forget everything you were shown in school. Forget the picture from the textbook. Figures frozen in ash, outstretched hands, poses of despair. For years we've been told a beautiful and convenient story. A volcano erupted, ash poured out. People didn't have time to escape. They were buried. The end, tragedy, curtain call. But in 2018, a group of Italian anthropologists from the University of Naples published results that tore this picture to shreds. They examined the remains using methods that didn't exist 20 years ago. CT scans, isotope analysis, bone microscopy. And this is what they found. The skulls of the Pompeii victims were shattered from the inside, not crushed by the weight of the rock above, not cracked by the impact, exploded from the inside. The cerebral fluid boiled instantly, turned to steam, and ruptured the skull like a pressure cooker, without a valve. On the inner surface of the bones are characteristic red-black mineral deposits. This isn't paint, not primer, not fresco pigment. It's iron from the blood, which boiled and burned away in seconds, leaving behind an oxidized trace on the bone. The temperature at which this occurs is between 300 and 500 degrees. Not gradual heating, not slow suffocation in hot air. No, instant contact with a superheated environment. The body doesn't have time to ignite. It explodes from the inside before the flames reach the outside. Soft tissue evaporates. The muscles contract post-mortem, twisting the limbs into a characteristic boxer's pose, not from pain, not from an attempt to shield themselves with their hands, but from the pure thermal deformation of protein. What we took for gestures of despair turned out to be the physics of combustion, and those very plaster casts that tourists gaze at with sad reverence are not the poses of a final prayer. These are the positions the body twists into when all the water boils out of it in a split second. Now think about it. If the basic image, covered in ash, suffocated, is so at odds with physical reality, it raises an uncomfortable question. Not about Pompeii, about us, about how easily we accept a version that simply sounds good, and about what really happened that day because it was a completely different story. August 24th, 1979, A.D. This date is ingrained in every textbook, every encyclopedia, every documentary. Every fifth grader knows it, every tourist who bought an 18-euro ticket to the excavations. The source is 2 letters from Pliny the Younger, written to the historian Tacitus 25 years after the events. 2 letters, rewritten by medieval monks several centuries later. Copies of copies, and on this foundation rests the entire chronology. No one was bothered by this until 2018. In October of that year, while clearing a wall in the 5th excavation area, archaeologists found a charcoal inscription, not carved in stone, handwritten on plaster on the wall of a house that had been rebuilt shortly before the disaster. A charcoal inscription is fragile. It doesn't survive rain or time. It could only have survived if the wall had been buried almost immediately after it was written. The inscription contains a date, the 16th day before the November Kalends, translated from the Roman calendar. That's October 17th, not August, October. The difference is almost 2 months. And here's the interesting thing. This inscription wasn't a lone clue. It was simply the drop that finally forced everyone to look at everything else. And there was a lot of everything else, and it had been lying on the surface for decades. The bodies of the dead were wearing warm woolen clothing, not light summer tunics, which would be logical for late August in Campania, where the heat is stifling. Wool, thick capes, closed shoes. In the storerooms of the houses were pomegranates, chestnuts, walnuts, rowan berries. All this was the autumn harvest, which physically does not exist in August. The wine in the sealed dolia had already undergone fermentation. It was the wine of the new harvest, which is harvested in September. Charcoal braziers stood in living rooms. No one lights braziers in southern Italy in August, where the temperature's already well over 104 degrees. Coins were found minted during a period that, according to numismatic catalogues, is dated later than August. And all of this was known. Not classified, not hidden, not concealed. It simply didn't add up to a question because no one dared ask. The date August 24th was too convenient, too established, too firmly imprinted in academic tradition. Changing it would mean changing thousands of publications, textbooks, exhibits, and museum plaques. And most importantly, it would mean recognizing that for 2 millennia, the entire scientific world relied on a single source, written from memory a quarter of a century later, and rewritten by monks centuries later, and never once cross-checked it against physical evidence. 2 months, a seemingly insignificant detail, but it's not just 2 months that matter. It's the principle. If the most basic fact, when it happened, turned out to be an error that sat at the foundation of our knowledge for 2,000 years without bothering anyone, then the next question inevitably arises, not about the date, about everything else. What else have we accepted simply because it was written that way? When we hear the word antiquity, a certain set of images automatically comes to mind. Pottery shards, oil lamps, people in togas writing with a wax stencil and counting on their fingers. Something simple, slow, manual. We look down on the ancient world from the heights of our smartphones and air conditioners, and we think we understand the scale of the distance. But then you arrive in Pompeii and start looking not at the frescoes but at the pipes, and that's where things get uncomfortable. Pompeii's water supply system isn't a stream connected to a fountain. It's an engineering network. Water flowed through an aqueduct from mountain springs tens of kilometers from the city, entered a distribution tower, the Castellum Aquae, and from there was distributed under pressure through lead pipes in 3 directions: public fountains, baths, and private homes. 3 priorities, 3 circuits. If the pressure dropped, the private sector was shut off first, then the thermal baths, and lastly, the street fountains. This wasn't just a water supply system. It was a water supply system with a prioritized architecture, an emergency shutdown system, and a well-thought-out hierarchy of consumers. A solution we today call smart infrastructure. Roads, the standard track width throughout the city, was about 143 centimeters. Not approximately the same, not plus or minus, the same from block to block, with tolerances that indicate a unified standard. Carts were fitted into this track like train cars into rails. Intersections are equipped with raised stones for pedestrian crossings, spaced so that the cart wheels could pass between them. This wasn't an accident. This is transport design. Sidewalks are raised above the roadway because water, rainwater, and sewage flowed along the roads. Pompeii had a sewer system, not a gutter in the middle of the street, an underground drainage system. Now, the baths. Roman baths aren't just hot water pits. The Stabia Baths complex in Pompeii includes changing rooms, cold, warm, and hot water halls, steam rooms, pools, and a palestra for exercise. Beneath the floors is a hypocaust, a system of channels through which hot air from the furnaces circulates. The floor is raised on brick pillars. The heat comes from below, warms the ceramic coating, and rises through the hollow bricks in the walls, the tubuli. If you replace the word hypocaust with radiant heating system with a convective loop, you get a description that a heating engineer would accept as accurate without reservation. 20 centuries ago. And finally, the thermopolia. More than 150 have been found throughout the city. Counters with recesses for built-in containers, a standard layout, identical from establishment to establishment. A counter, a heated area, a serving area, and sometimes a back room for on-site dining. If you peel away the ancient plaster and show the diagram to a modern restaurant consultant, they'll recognize the fast food format. Not an analogy, not a metaphor. A working business model with a replicable format. And here's where you need to stop and ask yourself one question. Not an enthusiastic, not admiring one, a cold one. Everything we see in Pompeii, the prioritized water supply, the standardized track, the underfloor heating, the replicable restaurant franchise, isn't a collection of random successes. It's a systemic project. Behind it lies not the talent of ancient craftsmen, but an engineering culture with standards, tolerances, and replicable solutions. We're used to calling these achievements of Roman civilization and putting an exclamation mark. But maybe it's worth putting a question mark. Not because it's unimpressive, but because we've never seriously asked ourselves where exactly this culture came from. It's as if complex systems arise out of nowhere, as if an engineering school of this caliber doesn't require centuries of accumulated experience, standards, and continuity, most of which we don't see anywhere in the region's previous history. And perhaps that's not because they didn't exist, but because we're looking in the wrong places. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, everything was still normal. The market was open. Food was being heated in the thermopolia. Someone was haggling over fabric. Someone was dragging an amphora along the pavement. Someone was arguing with a neighbor over a wall that had been moved half a palm. An ordinary day in a city of 20,000. The sun was high, and if anyone at that moment looked at Vesuvius, and they looked at it every day, it was simply part of the landscape like furniture, they would see nothing unusual. A mountain like a mountain. It wasn't even considered dangerous. The word volcano didn't exist yet. The Romans knew that Vesuvius had once erupted, but it was so long ago that it had become a myth, and the slopes of the mountain were planted with vineyards right up to the summit. Fertile soil, good wine, no reason to worry. And then, sometime between noon and 1 o'clock, the earth shook, and a column of ejecta shot into the sky from the summit of Vesuvius. Not smoke, not steam. A column of hot gas, ash, and crushed rock, accelerated by the pressure of the magma chamber to speeds the human eye can't detect. In a few minutes, this column rose to a height of 33 kilometers, the stratosphere. That's higher than modern passenger jets fly, higher than thunderclouds rise. The mass of ejected material reached 150,000 tons per second. Modern volcanologists classify this eruption as Plinian, and the name itself derives from this event. The explosivity index was 5 on a scale of 8. In terms of energy, it was 100,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Not 10 times, not 1,000. 100,000. The first hours were terrifying, but survivable. The column of ash and gas rising into the stratosphere began to cool and fall back. A rain of pumice, a lightweight, porous rock, in pieces ranging in size from a pea to a fist, began to fall on Pompeii. It wasn't lava. It wasn't fire. It was a hail of molten stones, burying the city at a rate of 15 to 20 centimeters per hour. It doesn't sound so scary until you count it. Within the first 6 hours, a layer more than a meter thick lay on the roofs of Pompeii. The weight of pumice per square meter of roof exceeded the critical load for which the wooden roofs were designed. Roofs began to cave in. Those hiding inside their houses found themselves trapped. Broken roofs collapsed, blocking their doors, and the rain continued from above. Those who ran outside found themselves under constant barrage of stones in pitch darkness as the ash cloud obscured the sun within minutes. Night fell in the middle of the day, and here a division occurred that determined who would survive and who would not. Most residents made the only correct decision: to leave, to gather what they could carry, take their families, and move away from the mountain. The roads to the south and southwest, to the sea and along the coast, were still passable. According to various estimates, between 15 and 18,000 people fled the city in the first hours. On foot, in carts, in complete darkness, under a hail of stones. But they left, and they survived. About 2,000 remained. Who were they? It's a question that becomes unsettling if you think about it long enough. The elderly who couldn't walk, the sick, the crippled, those who decided to wait it out, because earthquakes had happened in this region before. 17 years earlier, the city had already shaken, and no matter, we had rebuilt, we would survive this too. Those who didn't want to abandon their belongings, the shop, the house, the savings locked in a chest. Bags of coins and jewelry were found on several bodies. People had collected valuables before leaving, but never did. And slaves, those who weren't released, those who didn't even have the right to decide whether to flee or stay. The first phase lasted about 17 to 18 hours. Pumice hail, collapsing roofs, darkness, thunder, a sulphurous smell that cut the eyes and burned the throat. Scary, but technically survivable. Those who remained were still breathing. They were still waiting for it to end. Some barricaded themselves in basements. Some took refuge under arches. Some simply sat and waited. And then came the moment when the ash column, which had been rising into the stratosphere for 15 hours, exhausted its upward energy. It didn't dissipate. It didn't stop. It collapsed. 33 kilometers of incandescent material collapsed under its own weight. And what happened next had nothing in common with a hail of stones. But that's a story for the next part. And it will be completely different. What fell from the sky in the pre-dawn hours has no analog in everyday human experience. We have no common metaphor for this phenomenon, no suitable comparison from ordinary life. An avalanche is not the same thing because an avalanche is cold. An explosion is not the same thing because the explosion lasts for a second. A fire is not the same thing because you can run from a fire. A pyroclastic flow is a cloud of hot gas, ash, and rock fragments that moves across the Earth's surface at speeds of 100 to 700 kilometers per hour, with an internal temperature of 300 to 700 degrees. It does not rise upward like smoke. It spreads along the ground because it is too heavy. The suspension of solid particles makes it denser than air, and it flows downslope like a liquid, filling every hollow, every street, every doorway. It does not flow around obstacles, it rolls over them. Walls do not save. Basements do not save. Nothing saves. That night, Vesuvius erupted 6 pyroclastic flows, not just one. 6, one after another, in waves like blows. The first came down the northern slope around 1 in the morning. It didn't reach Pompeii. It covered Herculaneum, the city closer to the volcano, at the foot of the western slope. For Herculaneum, it was the end, instantaneous and absolute. But that's a different story. Pompeii was still standing at that moment. There were still people breathing. The second flow, Herculaneum again. The third, a little further, but still didn't reach Pompeii. The fourth, closer. The city stood about 10 kilometers from the crater, and each successive wave was more powerful and traveled further than the last, as if the mountain were taking aim. Those still in Pompeii at that moment couldn't see it. The darkness was absolute, but they could hear it, the roar, a growing rumble coming not from the sky, but from the ground, vibrating the walls. And then came the fifth wave. The fifth pyroclastic flow reached the northern walls of Pompeii. The upper part of the flow, the so-called surge, a wave of rarefied, superheated gas, overflowed the wall and swept into the city. The temperature of this cloud is estimated to have been between 300 and 400 degrees Celsius. Its speed was approximately 100 to 150 kilometers per hour. This was not a literal wall of fire. There was no fire. There was no flame, no combustion in the conventional sense. There was something worse, an invisible front of superheated gas and ash dust that flew into doorways, windows, cracks, and lungs. Anyone standing in the path of this front didn't have time to breathe. The first contact with the superheated environment caused instant thermal shock, laryngeal spasm, burning of the upper respiratory tract, and respiratory arrest. But most did not die of suffocation. They died from what happened in the next split second. Blood and biological fluids, when heated to 300 degrees, turn into a gas almost instantly. The brain boils. Muscle protein coagulates. Soft tissue literally evaporates from the body's surface, and what remains curls into a pose pathologists call a boxer's stance, arms bent, fists clenched, legs drawn up, not from pain, not from an attempt to shield, from the thermal contraction of muscle fibers that occurs after death. The body is reduced to a twisted, charred outline before the brain can even send a pain signal. If there's anything merciful about all this, it's speed. Death occurred in a time measured not in seconds, but in fractions of a second. The sixth flood engulfed Pompeii entirely. It was the most powerful. It swept through the entire city, spilled over the southern walls, and continued on toward the coast. Afterward, nothing living remained in the city. No people, no animals, no plants. The volcanic mass, hot ash, baked into a stone-like substance, filled the ground floors, buried the streets, and leveled everything into a uniform gray plain. The city ceased to exist, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a physical one. Where two-story houses had stood that morning, there was now a flat surface of gray tuff. No roofs, no walls, no landmarks. If any of the survivors had tried to return the next day, they would not have found the city. Not because they were lost, but because the city was gone. There was a field, and here it's worth lingering on one detail that often slips under the radar. The entire process, from the first emission to the sixth stream, from the beginning to its complete destruction, took not years, not months, not weeks, about 17 hours. A city that had been built over centuries, an engineering system that had worked for generations, 20,000 lives, thousands of buildings, a water supply, a sewer system, roads, libraries, archives, everything that had accumulated and improved over the centuries, all of it ceased to exist in the time it takes us to fly from Moscow to Novosibirsk. And if that isn't a reason to pause and reflect on the fragility of everything we consider durable, I don't know what is. Everyone knows about Pompeii. The name has become a byword, synonymous with catastrophe, suddenness, the destruction of an entire world in a single day. Films are made about Pompeii. Novels are written. Tours are given. Pompeii is a brand. But almost no one knows about Herculaneum. And that, if you think about it, is strange in itself, because the history of Herculaneum is more terrifying, more mysterious, and in many ways more important, yet it hasn't found its way into textbooks as firmly, hasn't become a cultural cliché, hasn't entered the public consciousness. And there are reasons for this silence. Herculaneum was closer to Vesuvius, just 7 kilometers from the crater, on the seashore. A small, wealthy, well-kept town. If Pompeii was a bustling trading hub, Herculaneum was something of a resort suburb for the wealthy. Villas overlooking the bay, marble floors, private libraries. The population was about 4,000 to 5,000. When Vesuvius erupted, the residents of Herculaneum found themselves in a paradoxical situation. They were closer to the volcano than the Pompeians, but the initial phase, the pumice rain, barely touched them. The wind blew the ash column southeast toward Pompeii. Herculaneum escaped with a light dusting in the first hours, and this, perhaps, was their undoing, because they thought they had escaped. Many did leave. They abandoned their homes, took their valuables, and set off along the roads along the coast. But not all. Several hundred people went down to the shore, to the stone boathouses, arcades for storing boats, built into the rock at the water's edge. The logic was clear. If the roads became impassable, we'd leave by sea. We just had to wait for the boats. They waited. The boats never came. We know this because in 1980, when archaeologists finally reached the shoreline of ancient Herculaneum, they found these boathouses, 12 stone arches facing the sea, and inside them, more than 300 skeletons, men, women, children, babies, jumbled together on top of each other in positions that left no doubt they were alive when the tide came. Some were hugging. One woman was clutching her child. The soldier, or what was identified as a soldier from the remains of his equipment, had a sword and a tool bag slung over his back. He made no attempt to flee. He stood facing the archway's exit. He waited. The first pyroclastic flow reached Herculaneum around 1 in the morning. Estimates ranged from 100 to 300 kilometers per hour. Temperatures at the entrance to the city reached 500 degrees Celsius. It didn't bury the city as pumice had engulfed Pompeii. It flooded it. The incandescent mass, a mixture of gas, ash, and debris, gushed through the streets like liquid, seeping into every opening, filling every room from floor to ceiling. And after the first flow came a second, and a third, and a fourth. Layer after layer, wave after wave. Each new flow laid upon the previous one and solidified. By morning, Herculaneum was buried under a layer of volcanic rock 20 meters thick, not 6 like Pompeii. 20. That's the height of a 7-story building, and this rock wasn't loose ash, not soft soil. It was tough, a fused mass that had hardened like concrete. The city wasn't buried. He was walled up. And here begins what makes Herculaneum truly unique. The temperature of the stream was so monstrous that organic matter didn't burn in the usual sense. It didn't turn to ash. It carbonized instantly. Wooden beams, furniture, doors, window frames, all of it charred in seconds and preserved as carbon casts of itself. Under normal conditions, Wood doesn't survive in archaeology. It rots over decades. In Herculaneum, wooden beds stand in their places after 2,000 years, charred, black, brittle, but intact. You can see the shape of the legs, the carving, the construction. Bread left in the oven turned into carbon casts of itself, a perfectly preserved loaf that you can pick up. Ropes, fabrics, fishing nets, all are charred and all in place. But the most incredible find was the Villa dei Papyri, a vast seaside estate on the outskirts of the city, believed to have belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law. A library was discovered there, 1,800 papyrus scrolls. Nowhere else in the ancient world had anything like it survived. An entire library, not in fragments, not in quotations from later authors, but physically, as objects you could handle. The problem was that the scrolls had turned into carbon cylinders, black, brittle, crumbling when touched. Unrolling them was impossible. They crumbled. For 200 years, researchers couldn't read a single line. Then, in the 21st century, technologies emerged that had never existed before. X-ray microtomography, computer recognition algorithms, and, in 2023, neural networks trained on the contrast between the charcoal of papyrus and the charcoal of ink. And the scrolls began to be read, without unrolling, by X-raying and reconstructing the text layer by layer, coil by coil. Right now, as you listen to this, somewhere in a lab, artificial intelligence is extracting from a charred cylinder words written by a man who lived 2 millennia before the invention of electricity. We still don't know what exactly is in these scrolls. Only a small portion has been read. 1,800 scrolls isn't a couple of letters. It's a volume comparable to a small university library. What texts were stored there? Lost works of Greek philosophers? Historical chronicles we don't know about? Technical treatises? We don't know. We don't know yet. And one last question to conclude this section. Pompeii is buried 6 meters under loose ash. Herculaneum is covered 20 meters under rock. Pompeii is 10 kilometers from the crater. Herculaneum is 7. The difference in distance is 3 kilometers. The difference in layer thickness is 14 meters. The difference in the nature of the destruction is fundamental. One city is buried, the other is sealed. One preserved cavities, empty spaces around the bodies, into which plaster was later poured for the famous casts. The other preserved the bodies themselves, skeletons, bones, teeth. We are accustomed to speaking of the eruption of Vesuvius as a single event. But the closer you look at the details, the less obvious it becomes that we are witnessing the same process with the same mechanism. 2 cities, 2 different types of destruction, 2 different methods of preservation, the same night. This is the end of part 1. We've analyzed what happened, or what we think happened. We've seen that the date was wrong, that the mechanism of destruction wasn't as we were told, that the city was more complex than we'd imagined, and that next to it lay another city we know almost nothing about. But all of this is just scratching the surface, because the real questions don't begin with what happened in 1979, but with what happened next, with how this city was discovered, how it was excavated, what was found beneath it, what wasn't found, and what perhaps they didn't want to find. That's what Part 2 will cover.